Well, we're almost halfway through our journey, Lenten journey towards the cross. So far, the narrative lection has helped us to hear a number of people's voices and stories of Jesus travelling all the way from Galilee right down to, as Kevin said last week, just outside of Jerusalem. Just outside of Jerusalem last week. Well, today our reading is from Mark 12, and we are now in Jerusalem. We have reached Jerusalem. You might have noticed that we skipped over Mark 11. That's because Mark 11 is the triumphant entry, and we sort of have a special Sunday that we look at that story, which will be coming up soon. We'll come back to Mark 11. But now we're in Mark 12, and as Jesus approached, but now especially as Jesus is in Jerusalem, that sense of urgency that we've been talking about, that sense of, I've got a lot to say, I've got a lot to address, I need to do it now, and I don't have time for you to not address the real issues in the room. I'm just going to cut to the chase now. Is certainly happening. That's gone up several notches, that feeling. And so today reading is a parable and a conversation, but I've got to give some bit of context here. If we look at the Jesus' diary for Holy Week, the beginning of Mark chapter 11 is Palm Sunday, and so we are now in Holy Week. These readings come out of Holy Week. So on Monday of Holy Week, Jesus went into the temple and turned over the tables and had that run-in with the religious leaders, to the point in Mark 11:18 we are told that the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill Jesus. So we are only days away from the cross, and we are being told that the religious leaders are getting ready to find a way to kill Jesus. If we skip forward only 9 verses still in Mark chapter 11, it's now Tuesday of Holy Week, and Jesus is walking back into the temples. Remember, he's just trashed this place, told them that they've made it a den of thieves, it should be a house of prayer, and the very next day he goes back. He goes back, even though these people are wanting to kill him. He goes back and begins to do more teaching. As I said before, this sense of urgency, I've got stuff to say, I need to say it now. And I know there's a risk in going back into the temple, but I need to do it. And this is when, at the end of chapter 11, Jesus is in the temple teaching, and the Pharisees question Jesus' authority. What authority do you have to do all this stuff, to say these things? There's a whole story there where Jesus turns that back around and doesn't actually give them an answer. But it's in response to that, these religious leaders wanting to try and kill Jesus and then questioning the authority of Jesus, that Jesus tells this parable. So Jesus is in the temple telling this parable. So on the surface, this parable of the vineyard workers, it seems fairly simple, isn't it? It's just a bunch of workers who are not doing what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to give back a portion of the harvest to the owner, and they're not willing to give the owner what is due, even to the point that they're willing to hurt and kill those people who are sent to collect that. But actually, as we're going to discover as we dig a bit more into this parable, it is a little bit more complex than that. So firstly, who is Jesus saying this parable to? Because if you picture what is happening here, they're in the temple, and you've got Jesus speaking. And so, yes, the religious leaders are there. The religious leaders are there because they've just asked Jesus the question about authority. And it even says that the chief priest is there. So the bigwigs of the religious hierarchy are there. But it's the temple, the outer courts of the temple, which were always busy anyway. And so the disciples would have been there, other followers of Jesus would have been there, and the crowd would have been there. as well. They're all hanging around listening to what's going on. So who did Jesus say this parable to? The lot of them? I guess it depends how you hear it. And each of these different groups have got different cultural and experiences that shaped the way that they interpreted this parable. For example, what Jesus is actually talking about here is a very common first century economic arrangement where people of influence would buy up agricultural land and then they would go into share farming with the locals, or often with the people who had previous owned the land and sold it to them. They would go into fair share farming, and so you would be able to, still get something off the land, and some of it would go back to the owner. Sorry, I've made that sound a bit too nice, haven't I? The reality is a bit more harsher than that. People with money or influence use their power to trap ordinary people in debt or unjust situations and force them to sell their farmland to them. Then the rich people require these workers to do the same work that they were already doing, but only get a portion of the harvest that they would have got. The large part of the harvest would go to these owners. It was an unjust economic system that kept the rich rich and the poor even poorer. It was not good what was happening. And so when Jesus told this parable, it depends what your experience was is how you heard it. So for example, you probably had the religious leaders who were probably part of this economic setup and owned land. They were probably going, yeah, Jesus is right. These workers are not giving the owner the respect that they are due. They need to respect the owner. Jesus is right. Yet at the same time as Jesus was telling the story, you probably had the crowd going, yes, when the servants got beaten up because they were fighting back against the unjust economic system. They probably were a bit confused when they ended up killing these people because, killing somebody to stand up against an unjust economic system is probably a little harder to swallow, but you get the idea. It depends who you are and how you hear this parable. So we have an economic overlay on this parable. We also have a biblical overlay on this parable because there is some understandings from the Old Testament that shape how you hear this parable. So, for example, if I go to Mark 12:1, the first verse of our Bible reading, it says, "A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower." Does that ring a bell? When have you heard that recently? Please someone say a sermon. Please someone say a sermon. Do you remember the sermon? It was the end of last year. In the Old Testament part of the narrative lectionary, I preached on a passage that had the exact same line in it from Isaiah chapter 5, where it was talking about a man dug up and cleared it of stones, planted with the choicest of wine. He built a watchtower around it, in it, and cut in a wine press as well. It's almost identical, this idea from Isaiah 5 and the parable that Jesus is saying. Well, identical up to a point. The issue that they're addressing is different. Isaiah was addressing an issue that the vines that were planted gave sour grapes. And the issue was that the owner had to cut out the grapevines, and basically start again because somehow these vines had gone sour. Where in Jesus' time, there's a criticism not of the vineyard, but of the workers in the vineyard. But still, there would be no doubt, if you were a first century person listening to Jesus, especially a first person Hebrew person, you would have immediately thought of Isaiah chapter 5 and tried to relate those two things together. But also, did anyone wonder about the part of the parable when Oh, just wait, I forgot a line there. Yeah. So who was Jesus criticising when he was criticising the workers? Was he criticising the people? We're actually told at the end of the parable who he's criticising. He's criticising the religious leaders. Whereas Isaiah 5 is criticising the entire nation, saying, you've lost your way, you've forgotten about God. Here, Jesus is clearly saying to the religious leaders, you're not running this vineyard very well at all. It's not working. You're not giving God what is due. One last point before we start to try to unpack all this back together again. Did anyone else have thought it was a bit weird that the owner just keeps on sending more and more servants? Especially when it's pretty obvious they're being bashed up and some of them killed. And yet he sends another one, and another one, and another one. It actually says he sent many. What's going on here? Is the owner naive, thinking, surely they won't do it again? What's happening here? You can put an Old Testament overlay on top of this that helps that make sense, which is the understanding of the prophets. See, if you put a prophetic lens over this, these servants become prophets. And there is certainly an historical pattern of the people of God being sent prophet after prophet after prophet. And even when the people would reject these prophets and not listen to their message, did God give up? No, because God is gracious and God is patient and God continues to send prophets to help us understand. So putting that sort of an overlay on top of it suddenly goes, well, that makes a little bit more sense of why there's so many. In normal practice, after about one or two, you probably would have sent the soldiers in. You wouldn't have kept sending servants to collect. So what's happening in this parable then? How do we make sense of it, and how does it make sense to us here today? I do find it interesting that Jesus is clearly speaking to the chief priests here. They've just questioned his authority, and he comes back at them with this parable. And depending how you read this parable, anyway, it does not look good on the religious leaders, because they are either corrupt and unjust, like the economic system, or Jesus is saying they're not the people that are causing the issues in the vineyard this time. It's not the people, it's the religious leaders that are causing the issue. Or Jesus is saying they're the ones who are rejecting the prophets from God, or even worse, they're the ones who are rejecting and killing God's own beloved Son. Can you see why these people are getting more and more angry with Jesus at this point? Jesus is going, I don't have time. I'm just going to cut straight to the chase and say, you people are the problem. You need to deal with it. So does that mean that all of you can forget about that parable and me and Kevin are the only ones that have to worry about it? No, I don't think it's that easy. Because Jesus goes on and gives a quote out of Psalm 118. The stone the builders rejected turned out to be the most important of all. I'm going to come back to that in a moment in my wrap-up, but I just want to quickly jump to the other part of the passage because they are connected, these two things. So remember, these people are ready to kill Jesus. The religious leaders are ready to kill Jesus. They're just afraid of doing it right there and then because the crowd of people love Jesus. And if they tried to arrest Jesus in the midst of the crowd, they think they're going to cause a riot. So they pause. But they realise if we can trap Jesus into saying the wrong thing, if he loses the support of the crowd, then we can arrest him and then we can kill him and everything will go back to normal. And so they asked a question to try and trap him, to get him to say the wrong thing. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? I don't need to explain this because you've probably heard sermons on this before, but it is a lose-lose question because you had Roman soldiers in the temple watching you. If you say, no, we should not pay taxes to Caesar, you get arrested by the Romans for being a disruptor. But if you say, yes, we should give taxes to Romans, the people hated paying this tax. You see, originally when the Romans came through, they conquered the land, but they didn't really stay there. But around about 6 BCE, they came back and they installed a standing army in the area where Israel was. And whenever you put an army into a conquered area, you got to pay for that army. How do you pay for that army? You tax the people. So it isn't just money that's going back to Caesar in Rome. It is money paying for the very people who are oppressing you. No wonder they don't want to pay taxes. And so Jesus is caught. Well, not really, because his answer is a clear deflection. Well, he deflects, but he also answers the question underneath. Firstly, by asking for a denarius, just like I asked for the $50 note, he was pointing out who was carrying a denarius. Most Hebrew people wouldn't carry one. Why wouldn't they carry a denarius? Because it had the image of Caesar on it, and it had a line on it that said, Caesar is God. And so the Hebrew people felt that if you carried a denarius, you were blaspheming. The only reason you carried a denarius if you were rich, because a denarius was a high-level coin worth about a day's wage. Most people paid with shekels and other little coins. No normal Hebrew person would carry around a denarius. So Jesus goes, have you got a denarius? And just like we did today, the chief priest whips out a denarius for him. Jesus basically showing everybody, see, they're the ones who are carrying around the coins. They're trying to trap me, and yet they're the ones carrying around the coins. But by also saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, it's more than just a clever deflection. It's actually saying, whose image do you want to live under? You've got the image of Caesar on this coin, and you can live under that system if you want. Or are you going to live under the image of God? Because you're made in the image of God. Those two words are the same in Genesis 1 and what they're quoting out of Psalm 18, that those Hebrew words are the same. So they're linking them together, saying, whose image do you want to live under? Whose example are you going to follow? Are you going to live under Caesar's or the world's way of living, or are you going to live under God's? I can imagine Jesus, in the spirit of what we've been doing up to this point, Jesus saying, let's cut to the chase here. Let's stop not talking about taxes. That's not the point. The point is, who are you going to follow? Are you going to live under Caesar's rules, or are you going to live under God's rules? Who are you going to associate with? I think that's a question that we're still confronted with, isn't it? So when Jesus says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, how does that relate to us? In Hebrew, where it says that cornerstone, it actually is a word that can be taken both ways. It can be taken both as the cornerstone or the capstone or keystone. I was having conflicting things when I was reading to say it was two different things. If someone can tell me, is that the capstone or is that the keystone? I don't know. I just put both of them up. But the Hebrew word can be interpreted as both of those. The cornerstone that's been rejected has become the most important of all, or the capstone that's been rejected has become the most important of all. And both of them work. Because Jesus is basically saying, if you're trying to build your life and you've got all these important aspects of your life together, like an arch, it's the capstone that gives that strength. It's the capstone that holds it all together. If you don't have the capstone in place, it will all fall apart. Jesus is saying, I'm that capstone. Or if it all has fallen apart and you have to restart it all again, Jesus is saying, you've got to get the cornerstone in right, that foundational stone in right. Because if you don't, it's going to fall over again. And Jesus is saying, I am that cornerstone. Don't forget, in everything else in life, most of which is good, that it's the capstone or the cornerstone that's most important. Don't forget about that. If you reject that, you will reject the thing that is most important. That is most important. So how are we going with this? Remember, if you think that I've skipped over lots of stuff, yes, I have. Come on Wednesday night, we've got Bible study. We'll go into more in depth. But to finish with, we're going to move into a time of communion. And as we move into a time of communion, I guess as we come forward to receive communion, I'm going to ask you the same question that Jesus asked the crowd. Whose image are you going to be associated with? Under whose example or whose standards are you living your life? Are we living under Caesar, or everything that the world says is right? Or are we living under God? Have we got our capstone in place? Have we got our cornerstone in place? So as we come to communion, let's just reaffirm the place of Jesus in our life. I think that's important as we move closer and closer to the cross. I'm going to invite Anne to come up, and she's going to lead us in prayer. And then we're going to sing a song as we prepare for communion. As we sing the song, we're also going to take up our offering. But we're going to do the prayer first.